Welcome back to e-learning course 0, Basics of Finance, session 3.2. In this session, our topic will be how to estimate the cost of capital. Learning goals of this session are threefold. The first goal is to understand how to estimate the cost of equity capital modifying our well-known stock valuation formula. The second goal is to recognize the problems associated with constant growth formulas. Finally, we'll learn how to use discounted cash flow models with two stages of growth in order to mitigate these problems related to the use of constant growth formulas. Estimating the cost of capital is pretty straightforward. Recall session 1.2, where we discussed the concept of growing perpetuities. We can apply this approach to modify the DCF valuation formula by assuming a constant growth rate of dividends. This implies that expected dividends grow at a constant rate, but does not preclude deviations from this trend. The stock price in period 0 equals the cash dividend divided by R minus G, where R is the cost of equity and G the constant growth rate in dividends. Solving this equation for R implies the cost of equity can be written as a function of the dividend yield and the expected growth rate in dividends. Suppose now we want to estimate the cost of capital for Northwest Natural Gas. Since Northwest is a utility company and utilities are a stable and mature industry, it seems that the constant growth model is the appropriate approach to choose. Assume that the stock of Northwest is selling for $49.43 at the beginning of the year. Dividend payments are expected to be $2 per share, which implies that the dividend yield is 4.1%. The hard part in order to determine the cost of equity is estimating G, the expected rate of dividend growth. Very often, people use forecasts of security analysts in order to determine the expected dividend growth rate. We will rely on such estimates as well in order to estimate the cost of equity. In the case of Northwest, analysts forecast a growth rate of 7.7% in annual dividend growth. Based on this forecast, we can come up with an estimate of the cost of equity. The dividend yield of 4.1% plus a growth rate of 7.7% implies the cost of equity are estimated to be 11.8%. An alternative approach to estimate long-run growth rates is related to the payout ratio, defined as the ratio of dividends to earnings per share. For Northwest, this payout ratio has averaged about 60%, which means that 40% are retained in the company. This is called plowback ratio. Moreover, assume that Northwest return on equity, ROE, has averaged about 11%. The ROE is defined as earnings per share divided by book equity per share. It follows if Northwest earns an ROE of 11% and reinvests 40% of its income, then book equity will increase by 4.4%. This implies that the dividend growth rate corresponds to 4.4%. Note that this approach requires that the plowback ratio and ROE remain constant forever. Using this dividend growth rate gives a second estimate of the cost of equity, which is found to be 8.5%. In our previous example, the underlying assumption to determine the cost of capital was that dividends grow at a constant rate over time. However, this is at best an approximation and rather unlikely to be accurate. It is a fact that long-term growth is very hard to maintain for almost any company. A potential remedy is to base cost of capital estimates on multiple firms from the same sector. In this example, we look at the set of railroad companies. However, this approach does not help to avoid errors in estimating the cost of capital. To illustrate the problem associated with constant growth formula, let's have a look at Growth Tech Inc. Suppose the current stock price, P0, is $80 and a dividend payment of 50 cents is expected to be paid. The company's plowback ratio is 80% and the return on equity is 25%. The product of plowback ratio and return on equity yields the dividend growth rate, which is 20% using the numbers in our example. If we assume that the future dividend growth rate to be constant, it follows that the cost of capital are estimated to be 21%. However, do you think it is reasonable to assume a long-term dividend growth rate of 20%? Rather not. Imagine that in the future, the firm's profitability might fall in response to these developments by investing less. This will have an immediate impact and lowers the dividend growth rate. Let's have a closer look at the problem of declining profitability. Assume again that the firm's response to the fall in profitability is by reducing its investments. This means the firm's plowback ratio decreases and the payout ratio increases. For example, in year 3, the payout ratio, which is 1 minus the plowback ratio, increases to 50%, and at the same time, the return on equity decreases to 16%. Note that the ROE is computed as earnings per share divided by the book equity. It finally follows that the subsequent dividend growth rate drops to 8%. Now let's use our well-known DCF model under consideration of the previous introduced modifications. More specifically, in year 3, investors view the company as offering 8% per year in dividend growth. We can use the constant growth formula to calculate the stock price in year 3. This is the dividend of year 4, which is $1.24, divided by R minus the growth rate G of 8%. Using the dividend payments for year 1 to 3, which are 50 cents, 60 cents, and $1.15, and today's stock price of $50, it follows that we can solve the DCF formula for the cost of capital R using an iterative approach. This is usually done using a computer. Doing so implies the cost of capital are estimated to be 9.9%. Investors very often categorize stocks into value stocks and growth stocks. Growth stocks are based on investors' expectations of capital gains and future growth in earnings, while value stocks are stocks that offer a dividend income already today. For instance, a firm without growth does not plow back any earnings and pays a constant dividend. Stocks of such firms are similar to a perpetual bond, which implies the expected return is the dividend payment divided by the current stock price. We understand now the difference between a growth and a value stock. Let us have another look at the example of Fledgling Electronics, a well-known growth stock. Assume earnings per share of Fledgling Electronics are $8.33, and that the company pays out a dividend of $5. Based on these assumptions, it follows that 40% of the earnings are plowed back by the company. If we further assume that Fledgling has a return on equity of 25%, we can conclude that dividends are expected to grow at a constant rate of 10%. We are now in a position to determine the stock price with growth and no growth. Substituting in the corresponding numbers, it follows that the stock price under no growth is estimated to be $55.56, while the stock price with growth is estimated to be $100. The difference between these two prices is called the present value of growth opportunities. In our example, Fledgling is a growth stock because net present value of future investments accounts for 44% of the stock price. Let's have a look now at another example of a growth stock. Consider Alphabet Inc., the parent company of Google. The company has never paid a dividend and plows back all its earnings into the business. The stock price in January 2018 was $1,086.4. The earnings per share were reported to be $29.92. If we assume the cost of equity to be 10%, the stock price would be estimated to be equal to $299.2. Based on this computation, it appears that investors are valuing Alphabet's future investment opportunities at $787.2, or at 72.46% of the current stock market value. After having carefully studied session 3.2, please start with the review questions.